if I'm a young startup and say, I want to be a sports book, what would you tell me to do for my customer service operation?
So it's a worthwhile expenditure. It's not as easy to see the return, and it's not as sexy as marketing and tech and product, but I think it's really important.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.
What is up, everybody? I am Jason Trost, the host of Business of Betting podcast. Today, I'm joined with Rob Davies, the COO of PowerPlay. Welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Jason. I'm glad to be here.
So let's kick off. I was looking at your CV, and you have a PhD in philosophy, which I find super interesting. I don't think I meet too many people in my daily life that have a PhD in philosophy, let alone people from the betting industry. So tell us about your PhD and what was your thesis in?
My thesis was about arguments for and against religious toleration in the 17th century. So a philosopher called John Locke, he was famous, amongst other things, for some of the thought that sort of warped into the Declaration of Independence. But specifically, it was around toleration and arguments for religious toleration in the 17th century. And you might think that's completely nothing to do with what I do now. But I think there were sort of two important arguments that I focused on that Locke sort of propagated. One was about toleration being actually, or persecution fundamentally be just being irrational, because you can't actually change people's beliefs. So I'm a Bolton Wanderers fan, and you could make me say that I'm a Manchester United fan. You could hold me down and beat me up, and I could say I was a Man United fan. But the sort of fundamental point is that deep down, I'm a Bolton Wanderers fan and always will be a Bolton Wanderers fan. So this idea of the sort of like liberal ideal that you can decide what you believe, and you can decide to believe in one thing, and that certain beliefs are wrong and certain beliefs are right. You know, he challenged that and said, actually, it's about accepting that, you know, there's beliefs that I have that that people have that I just don't understand, like people who believe in Brexit or wanted Brexit, people who believe in Trump. But, you know, you can think you're wrong and be intolerant towards those, or actually just try and understand why they think differently. And that's a fundamental reason, I think, to be tolerant and accepting and understanding of other people's beliefs. So that was the one argument. The other one was about fallibility and the fact that you just might be wrong. And I just think that's really important in business and in life, to accept that whether you've got a gambling angle, you've just got to accept that you might be wrong. You know, I think our industry, there's quite a lot of bluster at times in our industry, and people who think they know which markets you can make lots of money on, or which affiliate deals you can get for the cheapest. But actually, you know, being humble and accepting that you're fallible and you might get it wrong is another reason to be tolerant. So although it was very abstract what I did, I do think it has sort of resonance in the way I work and the way I behave and interact with others.
So when you were looking at your thesis, was it trying to understand his point of view, or were you trying to argue for and argue against his point of view? What was your specific twist on it?
So those two arguments, I said, there's some sort of debate about what the main arguments for and the language he uses and what are the implications of those. So yes, it was very much about interpreting those I believe were the correct interpretations of the two strongest arguments for toleration. And it was about applying them in the modern world. And you know, there's a debate in political philosophy between what's called liberalism, which is the view that you sort of really can choose who you want to be and who you are, and an alternative view called communitarianism, which is really saying your values are really, and what you do is really based on who you are. So the question of who you are determines what you do, whereas liberals just think you just do whatever you are, and that is who you are. You can be anything you want to be. So I think there's a sort of real core of truth around how we acquire values, you know, and how we should behave in the world based on that argument.
So, like, one of the things that comes up in America a lot is this idea of a fundamental freedom for oneself versus somebody else's freedom based on their religious values. So, for example, if some religious couple is against homosexuality and somebody comes in and asks to have a cake made to celebrate a gay marriage, does this baker have the right to refuse to bake the cake? Does the religious belief give them the permission structure to not honor somebody else's freedom? How would John Locke look at the cake? I don't know if this is a famous case that was decided by, pretty sure, the Supreme Court in the United States. How would John Locke look at something like that?
And I think it obviously becomes difficult when you look at jurisdictional boundaries. You look at, like, you can't, in some senses, the beliefs and values in one geographic area are different to another, and what do you have if you have conflict? And I don't think there are easy answers to cases like that, but I just think being tolerant and understanding and accepting other people's point of view is important. So I don't think I could give an answer as to which is the right, but I just think it's too easy to judge other people and believe their views are right and wrong. And it comes back to the fallibility piece as well, actually accepting that you just might be wrong about this. You might not know the true, the true route to salvation. And that, I think if you would take that approach, these conflicts don't necessarily dissolve away, but they become less important.
Very interesting. And what did you want to be an author or an academic, or what was your thinking?
Yeah, I think an academic. So I studied for 4 years. At the end of that year, I got funding. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship for the 3 years that sort of paid my fees and living expenses. And then in the final year, I didn't. So I did a bit of teaching. They sort of tend to use PhD students for that. But I needed a part-time job. So William Hill, I was in Leeds University. So William Hill had a telephone betting call centre in Leeds. So I decided that I would go and work there and take bets on a Tuesday night and a Saturday, because it sort of fitted in with my university timetable. And then I sort of always had the intention to go back into academia, but they had a graduate scheme. So I got into the graduate scheme, and then they moved me to Southern Ireland. And I helped run they moved all their stuff offshore for a couple of years to Southern Ireland. So I helped run that contact centre in Athlone in Ireland for a couple of years, and then came back and ran a call centre in Sheffield. Then I moved to Ladbrokes. So, maybe one day when I've finished my career in gaming, I'll go back. It actually sits on my bookshelf there, my PhD. And I always think it wasn't particularly well written, but I could probably get AI to rewrite it now and do a much better job than I did.
Do you want to get back into academics at some point, or get into writing?
Maybe not writing, but academic. I really enjoyed the teaching side. I loved standing up in people and explaining concepts and explaining ideas. I loved the interaction with the students and helping and supporting them. I think academia is very, very competitive. It's very much based on publishing articles, getting an angle, and it's just hard graft. I know, when I was in my 30s, I knew people who did a PhD with me, who were still grafting and still earning very little, doing bits and pieces of teaching just to get enough publications to get an academic position. And I just think you've got to be really talented and really, really resilient to continue, particularly something like philosophy. There's not philosophers, there's no natural job for us really. So apart from academia or maybe the gambling industry.
Well, my wife studied literature at the Sorbonne, and I think even though there's, besides being a publisher perhaps or a writer, there's not necessarily a clear path, but I think when you go deep into sort of the humanities, it teaches you how to think, you understand patterns of humans, you could read people better. My wife is incredibly good at reading people, her EQ's off the charts, and I think a lot of that came from her ability to read all these stories and then internalize all the different motivations that people have. Whereas me, I'm a mathy black and white guy, like I'm not the one who guesses who's the murderer at the end of the film. I'm always shocked because I'm not basically able to read everybody's motivation. But my wife's always like, oh, it's the butler. Yeah, it's the butler. So I think there's a lot more to the humanities than sort of society might necessarily give it credit for, because you'll be able to understand people better, which is, half the battle in life. I don't know if you caught the episode, but I talked to an American guy a few episodes ago on the podcast, and he had to do a debate, Bill Pascrell, on the morality of betting and gambling. Have you thought much about that with your sort of your philosophy?
Yeah, I think if you met me sort of 20 years ago, when I was 25 years ago, when I was finishing my PhD, I was very liberal in my views, and to the liberal about all the sorts of social liberal type issues like drug use and pornography and prostitution, all those sort of things. I was just like, people should just be allowed to do what the heck they want. And I think, there is an extent to which you grow up, you have kids, your attitude changes. I think my attitude now towards it is, I think a lot of the protections that we have in place are sensible. And I think it's a sort of more, I guess, utilitarian perspective on things. I do think people should be able to gamble. I do think people should be allowed to choose the things that they get pleasure from. And I don't think it's necessary for the state to prohibit things like that, but I do think it's sensible and proportionate that there are checks in place to, prevent people getting addicted or to just prevent the harms associated with gambling. And I probably maybe wouldn't have shared that view 25 years ago.
If I'm understanding you correctly, you would say it's fundamentally moral, but there should be guardrails from society to prevent abuse.
I think people, in there's things that you should not be allowed free choice in. You should not be allowed to go out and murder people. And I think there are black and white, although there's a separate case of what that truth looks like. But I do think that there are certain activities, it's okay to regulate the harm. But I think if people want to go out and gamble, I don't see anything fundamentally wrong with that.
Great. Well, let's pivot to customer service, an area that's near and dear to my heart. So it sounded like you sort of it was kind of a side gig that sucked you into the industry, and then you ended up going down the path of customer service. Did you get pigeonholed in this because you were the philosophy guy that likes people and you were happy to deal with people, or was it something that you saw that needed to be improved? Because you've been in and around customer service for the better part of 20 years, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, I think so. In the last couple of years, I've taken on a sort of more commercial role, and I actually find that interesting. There's part of me thinks maybe I should have done this earlier in the career. Maybe I'd have made a bit more money if I'd have done it earlier in my career. But I think managing large teams, I really enjoy. I enjoy the diversity of managing large teams. I've also done it I've done it in Antigua, in Bulgaria, been managing teams for operations in Africa, in the Caribbean, in Central America. So I think there's a natural, desire. I love travel. I love, understanding and appreciating other cultures. So I think I've really enjoyed that. And I do think, actually, I'd probably not maybe thought about it as much, but the people aspect, managing large teams and diverse people, trying to motivate them, trying to understand them, trying to get the best out of them, I think is probably just naturally customer operations has felt right for me. And I do think it's a little bit neglected in the gambling industry. I just don't think companies really take customer service particularly importantly. I think part of that stems from this sort of conflictual nature between gamblers and punters. And I think that, some of the terms that, not so much in customer service, but in trading or in fraud, some of the labels that are, some are rude, some are downright offensive, that they actually use for our customers. And I think it's important people recognize the value of the customers. That's where the money comes from. And it's easy to denigrate them, and it's easy to think of them as the enemy, whereas actually they're not.
For example?
In, how do you mean?
The terms for the lovely customers of
I
betting
think fraud has,
Let's pull the curtain back.
Fraud teams cause people like joyriders who I've never actually really understand completely what a joyrider is. No goods traders often call them no goods. Because palpable error is interesting in that, traders, you'll speak to them and they'll think there's a code of honor whereby they would never take advantage of a palpable error. And anyone who does so, is worthy of criticism. Whereas actually, if they see one, they'll be the first people to get on and try and exploit that. So I do. And I think it's important in the teams that I've managed and ran, it's really important for them to realize that, yes, these customers at times can be difficult, at times they can be demanding, but actually that's where the revenue from our business comes from. And money's an emotive subject, and it's not surprising at times they're going to get upset and angry, but it's really important that we treat them well, but also fairly. And I think sometimes the way things like operators deal with palpable error isn't fair and transparent. I think the fact that sometimes you don't have a right to adjudication, I don't think is fair. And I think customers should always have that. I think if you're going to limit a customer, I think you should tell them why. I think and tell them what you're going to restrict them to. Is it X%? So I think those are the areas where you can deal with your customers better. You can be open about your service levels. You can say, we resolve 80% of our queries to a customer satisfaction, and stick that on your website.
What do you mean by palpable error?
So palpable error is when the odds are wrong. So, and palpable is always the source of conflict and misunderstanding. What constitutes a palpable error? And historically, I think operators have just said, look, we'll just void off all the bets. I think if they void off all the bets, yes, if it's a clear and obvious error, but often will void off the winning bets and they'll forget the losing bets, because there's some people who, through no fault of their own, just won't realize that the odds were wrong. You should void those losing bets as well. A thing we're doing at PowerPlay is that I've done a deal with unabated.com to give us prices for DraftKings and FanDuel. So if we make a mistake, the problem is when operators make a mistake and then you ask them to work out what the correct odds are, they're always going to downplay it. The traders will always say, if it was a 10-1, if they got it wrong, it's 10-1 shot. and it should have been evens, they'll say, no, it should have been a 4-to-1 shot. So I think what we do is we say, look, if we've made a mistake, we'll use their prices, because it's not fair that we decide what the price is because we're biased. So yeah, I think there's things operators can do to handle those types of errors.
So basically you're saying that if you misprice something and based on the DraftKings FanDuel price via unabated, you will void the trade in the favor of the bookmaker.
If you've got a winning bet and say we priced it at 10-to-1, but the market was 2-to-1 because we've made a mistake, but
You'll
we'll
reprice
reprice it. So we'll settle the winning bet rather than just void the bet off. We'll settle the winning bet and give you the best price available with another operator.
Okay, well, let's test you, philosophy guy. Why don't you argue the counter case to say that's unethical action by the bookmaker? Let's see. Let's test your academic muscle here.
Well, I mean, the obvious response is that it's your fault. If you've made a mistake, then you should be
you being the bookmaker.
You being the bookmaker. Then I think the difficulty with that from an operator's point of view is you want to have some sort of protection because and it's less so, to be fair, and maybe there's more of a case to have to abide by those mistakes. But historically, it would be keying errors and you'd put 1,000-to-1 when it was 10-to-1. And if you combine that with some sort of right to have a bet at a particular price, small operators like us would go out of business very quickly. So I think it's right that there's some protection in place.
You pivoted awfully fast to the...
I mean, and I can genuinely understand the other side of the argument, but I think...
Let's hear it. Let's play the exercise out. It's your fault. Yeah, what else? It's the bookmaker's fault. Is that it?
You tell me. How would you argue it?
Well, I guess I'm arguing that maybe the rules are unfair. I guess from a moral perspective, it's like you are offering a price, the buyer comes in and decides to make a trade at that price. That's sort of the fair price. And if you don't have confidence in the price that you're offering, you shouldn't be offering that price.
Yeah, and I think there's a key difference here. And I think not having the confidence in the price and making a mistake is fine. And absolutely, you should settle according to that. What I'm talking about is where it's clearly a mistake and someone's keyed something else and a system's gone wrong. And the problem is that if you're always adhered to that price and then potentially you have something where customers that aren't allowed to be restricted or you've got to honour that bet at the particular price, you only need to make 3 or 4 of the mistakes and you've no longer got a business. That's the reality and that's the challenge and that's why the rules are in place.
So in terms of stake factoring or limiting punters, does PowerPlay limit bettors when they win too much?
Yeah, it does. And I don't think, the exchanges is obviously different, but I don't think there's many operators that don't. It's interesting. I think Massachusetts have been looking at this and I just think it's really, I think in one of your previous pods, you talked about that being a really, sensible and proactive thing for a legislator to look at. And I absolutely agree. I think, it's good that they're looking at stuff like this. I think from a commercial point of view, the difficulty lies in if we're the only ones doing it, then we're soon going to get picked off and we're soon going to be, just taking unprofitable business. I guess from a political point of view, I can't think of many analogies where a regulator or legislation would actually say you have to effectively serve a customer. So you actually have to give them a better, I can see, say, provision of healthcare or provision of education, public goods, but, some sort of inalienable right to bet or not have your account restricted or closed, it feels like a little bit of overreach. But I do think there is stuff around fairness and transparency that can be done. So if you are having your account restricted, I think it's right that they should explain why. I think they should commit to being reviewed. There may be somewhere you can go to have that reviewed independently. So I think there's stuff you can do around that, but I think I'd probably fall short of just not allowing restrictions.
Yeah, I think what I said on the pod is I think it's unethical behavior, but it should be legal, I guess. Like, I don't know if it should be legislated against, but I think it's a sign that bookmakers are not very good at bookmaking, because if you zoom out a little bit, the average margin of a sports book is 10-ish%. And you can be very, very, very bad at bookmaking and make money if you're charging a 10% margin per sports bet. Not only that, but if you screw up on the pricing, you have this mechanism to void the trade or reprice it to your liking. And secondly, you have the ability to cap the amount that sort of winning punters can bet. It just sort of it makes it way too easy for the bookmaker, and it makes it way too hard for the punter. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I think 10% margins, I'd love if we had 10% margins. I think 4 or 5%, maybe 6% on sportsbooks more realistic for us. But, I do think there's scope for sort of more openness and more transparency, more fairness around that. I think one of the difficulties actually in the modern age is that, you've got to admit that we're a relatively small operator. Yes, we have good traders, but for us to spread ourselves across a massive range of sports and betting, and with AI tools and that are in the punter's hands, it isn't that hard to get an edge and consistently get an edge. So yeah, I don't want us to feel sorry for us necessarily and say it's too hard. But I think there's always scope for that sort of this battle between punter and customer to be a little bit fairer and more open. But I don't think, I guess that's where I think we are.
If you're making 6%, I mean, I don't know how much you can share if it's commercially sensitive or not, but my understanding is DraftKings, FanDuels of the world are making 10, 11%, and 6% feels quite low for a bookmaker.
Yeah, and I guess it's what product. So I think, yes, I think they're pushing customers a lot to same game parlays and stuff with really high margins. We do less of that partly because there's some restrictions on our platform. But, I guess it's where you want to be with your punters. We don't mind having a relatively low margin if we can take the action, if we can have it, and customers feel they've got a good chance of beating us. If you want to push all your punters to products which are really high margin, then, that's not necessarily the model we follow.
So my vision for the industry, and I'm curious to get your thoughts, is that at some point, bookmakers are just going to add a margin on top of the wholesale price, i.e. the exchange price. So like if you are a small team and you're having trouble pricing all these things and you need to, I'm going to be hyperbolic, but you need to avoid trades and you need to limit punters from winning too much. Why don't you just build it on top of an exchange and add a margin? Like, why would you go through the exercise of pricing everything yourselves?
I guess with exchanges, I mean, I've used exchanges. I don't know how. There's maybe a bit of a misconception, not misconception is probably the wrong word, but I think if you're involved in the industry and you understand the variety of different ways to bet there are, and you might well be drawn towards the exchange in terms of the best prices, in terms of liquidity, in terms of ability to get the bet on. But I think a lot of punters just want something simple and straightforward. They want a bet at a particular price, a particular amount of money. And I think there's clearly scope and demand for the services we offer, compared to exchanges.
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm not talking about changing the interface. I'm saying instead of I assume you have traders sitting somewhere like moving markets, right? Like instead of having traders, why don't you take an exchange, build PowerPlay on top of an exchange, take the exchange price, add your margin on top of it.
I feel like you're trying to sell me something.
It's more because you've been in the industry for a long time and, you're talking about a lot of these issues with pricing and people fat finger things and, it's human error and it's not hard to get picked off. That's why we need I'm sympathetic to all those things. It's more like I would feel like you guys would be a prime example of take the exchange as the wholesale market, build your sportsbook experience on top of it like a broker. Think about it like Charles Schwab or E-Trade or Ameritrade. Like Ameritrade and E-Trade and Charles Schwab, they don't have the exchange of the network. They're built on top of it, just like you would have better customer service and yada 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 or whatever you're pitching to your customers in Canada. And then you don't have to worry about all these pricing issues.
To be honest, it's something I've not given a huge amount of thought to before. And I think it's an interesting idea. And you're right, it would resolve some of the pricing errors. But I guess, an exchange is still vulnerable to technical problems and pricing errors, is it not?
Of course. But presumably, just like the New York Stock Exchange is open to errors. But, over time, the exchange becomes more robust and the pricing errors get fewer and, like NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchange still have errors from time to time. So, all exchanges will have errors. But that way you sort of I feel like this industry is so old fashioned and so backwards. Like the fact that guys are sitting in front of a computer with an arrow button just to me feels very, 1970s stock trading.
Yeah. And I think it has changed. And I think when I came into the industry, I remember working as head of customer service for Ladbrokes years ago, and we used to have what are called event escalation. So it was basically when there was an error in pricing and all the events had come up on this massive spreadsheet and everyone in my team would moan and go, oh, they've fucked it up again. And those just seem very, very common. Whereas nowadays, I just think the technology and the tools, that they're less common. We deal with them much less than we did, but they still happen.
Cool. So there's a lot of young startups that listen to this company. If somebody is starting out from scratch building customer service, I think you can kind of think about customer service broadly speaking in two paths. One that's sort of high touch. We really care about the customer. We're going to take your phone call. We're going to dig deep. We're going to give you the warm fuzzies. That's sort of one path. And the other path is it's cold, the cost center. It takes a lot of energy. Customers are annoying. They take up time. Let's make it self-service. What would you advise if I'm a young startup and say, I want to be a sports book, like what would you tell me to do for my customer service operation?
I think I tell you one thing. I think I'd ignore the stuff about automation. I'd say it's wrong. Although, when at the outset of this podcast, I talked about fallibility, not saying that I'm always right, but I think we did one of the companies I work for, we did some really interesting analysis, and it was partly to try and justify, because there was some cost pressure at the time. So, operations, customer service teams are big, they take up a lot of cost. But I felt that they added value. And so what we did is we actually looked at the attrition rate of customers who contacted customer service versus those who didn't. Now, the thing is, you have to control for certain variables. So what you get is customers who are naturally play a lot will contact customer service more. Also, customers who play a lot naturally tend to be more loyal. But if you control for that, so we looked at two groups of customers, one that had the same propensity to contact customer service. Okay, so in all other respects, the same. The ones that contacted customer service were about 15% more loyal, so their attrition rate was about 15% lower than the ones who did. And there's a fairly obvious reasons for that, because if you can't log into your account and the only place you can go to solve that is customer service, then if you don't, continue to transact. But I think underneath that, and with any businesses in the world, there's always a correlation between the strength of the customer service and the value of the business. And you look at that across multiple industries. I think that's the same for betting, and it does get ignored. It comes back to what I talked about, this sort of conflict thing, and people think we don't need to care about our customers because they're just trying to beat us and they're just difficult. But I think actually we've got some really concrete evidence that shows that valuing your customers, building relationships with them, makes them more loyal and will actually help your business. So it's a worthwhile expenditure. It's not as easy to see the return, and it's not as sexy as marketing and tech and product, but I think it's really important. I think the other thing I'd say to them is, like, you can measure lots of things in customer service. It's really easy to do. It's sort of contact centers, throw off metrics, handle time. You have your QA teams that measure what you think the customers want to hear. But the one thing that I've done, particularly in the last few years, and it's been a sort of learning curve to get to that, is focus on resolution rate. So ask your customers, was the query resolved? Because if you contact customer service, that's ultimately what you want. And build your measurements around that, build your teams around that. So the teams will suddenly become really interested in managing the performance of the people, because they want the agents who resolve queries better doing best, and they want to help the ones that don't. They will start to put pressure on your marketing team for writing offers that don't make sense. They'll put pressure on the tech teams for if a customer journey doesn't work, because that's meaning customers are coming in and they can't resolve those queries. So to start off, those are two things I'd say. I said, don't forget the importance of customer service, because it will add value to your business, and loyal customers will help you grow your business. And just focus on resolution rate. Ask your customers, was their query resolved, and measure everything around that.
And do you have strong opinions on channel, email versus chat versus phone?
I just think they should be able to choose. So we have, and which is common, it's moved from about 50-50 chat to phones. I mean, you take email separately, but to about, with PowerPlay, we're about 90% chat, 10% phone. But I think it's really important that customers have a choice. So the way we display it in our portal is here's a knowledge base. If you want to find the answer yourself, go for it. But at no point, a lot of you mentioned sort of automation or cost cutting, use these chatbot journeys, and they're just like hell on earth. So you end up stuck in a chatbot you can't get out of. So yes, put a self-service solution there if customers, and customers increasingly want to solve problems themselves. But you should always have chat. You should always have a phone number. You should always have an email, and let the customer choose. So I'd be sort of agnostic, but I think the importance is have as many channels as you can.
Pivoting topics, you have a little bit of experience in offshore, probably more than a little bit, experience in offshore bookmakers. I guess you might call them black or gray market operators. I've always been sort of, we've gotten license. We don't have a Curacao license. We have a UK license, Malta license, and a few states license. From my perspective, it seems crazy that the Bodogs of the world can continue operating, hoovering up all this money. Nothing seems to happen. No enforcement seems to happen. I presume Bodog and others are making billions of dollars in profit. What am I missing about the landscape? Like, why do I get so indignant about the situation? And where am I wrong?
I don't think you are. I mean, I think with PowerPlay now, we have a license in Ontario. When licenses become available in Alberta or British Columbia, we will acquire those. So I'm, firmly in the regulated sector. The majority of my career has been there. But yes, you're right. I've worked on the other side of the fence. I think there was a period, and particularly when I worked for Bodog in Antigua, there wasn't regulated betting in the States to the extent there was, and it was filling a hole by a piece of legislation that changed things and sort of threw everything up in the air. I guess I think one of the challenges, I certainly feel more comfortable now working on this side of the regulated side of the industry, is how you sort of, because these companies that are doing that, they're making, as you say, they're making money. They're employing lots of people, and actually, in general, they're not a load of crooks just out to make loads of money and not care. They want, much as the regulated operators do, they want regular customers, they want loyal customers, they want to treat them fairly with respect. I think it's now where we are, and maybe I'm being idealistic, and I don't think it could happen. It would probably require some sort of legislation at federal level. Is there a way that they can be brought into the fold and can get, licenses? I just don't know. I think that's the challenge at the moment, whether they would want to. And obviously, if they go down the regulation path, there'll be this question of almost like reparations for all the tax that they should have paid for over the years. So, I think we're at a difficult position now. I think my concern, I guess, is less, having worked on that side of the fence, those sort of operators. It's more, the new incumbents who really, I don't think, care an awful lot. Crypto casinos who just will take any business anonymously. I think that's, I know there's a lot of concern in regulated countries like Britain, where I am, that the more the regulation tightens, that the unscrupulous, unregulated operators. And I think that's probably the thing that concerns me the most. The cryptocurrency, crypto casinos, and just completely unregulated, who probably don't care about player protection at all.
Do you have a theory of why the Bodogs of the world can seemingly operate with impunity?
I guess it's about enforcement, isn't it? About how you go about enforcing. I think there are, and it requires that, I guess, federal coordination in order to, there's certain states in the US that I know have done it. There's even in the, there's certain countries in Bulgaria, where I lived there for a couple of years, and the Bulgarian authorities were actually able to block the IP addresses. So this was well-known. Companies like Bet365 at the time were operating in not having a license. They will always get licenses now, and they operate at the regulated side. But those sorts of mechanisms may be more effective in stopping than indicting people who live, thousands of miles away and it's difficult to prosecute against. I guess it's, it's how you regulate and how you prosecute those things. And if you're not able to effectively, then they will continue to operate.
Before I let you go, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Well, maybe I should go back to being an academic philosopher. You've sort of sparkled that. But I think, I enjoy what I do. I think the last couple of years, taking on sort of more a rounded view of the business and being responsible for profit and loss, I think that's probably the avenue that I'll stick in. But customer operations will always be, just sort of close to my heart, and the importance of customers in this industry.
Great. Well, thanks for stopping by, Rob.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Cheers.
Mate.
The Business of Betting podcast is presented by Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. 4 out of the top 5 U.S. operators personalize player experiences with Optimove, the #1 CRM marketing solution for the iGaming industry. Learn more about Optimove by requesting a demo at optimove.com/businessofbetting. And if you like what you see, you will get your first month free.